Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 76 of the Simpa Life Podcast. I do hope you are having a wonderful week. It is slowly getting brighter, not necessarily warmer, as I warned you last week. We have had our full spring, more fool you, more fool me, because I went out to try and go camping. I went for a day on the beach, and it was not the warmest at all. I've got to remember, I do still live in the northeast of England, and that sun can be deceptive. Do hope you're enjoying your week, whatever you're up to. It is a big one this week. This week's guest, it is our first sitting MP. Hopefully, after this recording goes out, he will continue to be a sitting MP, but we shall see. Today's guest is a former indie dance and house DJ and event manager. I did not know that before researching Jeff for this. He is a former city councillor and current MP for Manchester Withington constituency for the Labour Party. He is also the co-founder of the Labour Campaign for Drug Policy Reform, chair of the all-party parliamentary group on mental health, and the co-chair of the APPG, which is the acronym for that, Humanist group, as well as the author of the recent Medical Cannabis Access Bill, or as the long title is, a bill to make provision about access to cannabis for medical reasons and for connected purposes, which we'll discuss further shortly. But without further ado, Jeff Smith, folks.
Hi, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, I'm really glad that we managed to hook this up. As I said, I've been sort of active for a few years, sort of pestering MPs with emails, and Roberta Blackman-Woods, before she retired in Durham, bless her, had to see me several times during her surgeries to complain about cannabis and drug policy and various other things. But as I was just saying to Jeff sort of in the warm-up there, guys, I think we're going to park medical cannabis for a little bit and have that as the bulk of the conversation at the end. And so I kind of wanted to go through, a lot of the other things that cropped up when I was doing research for this guest. Mm-hmm. So I suppose the first question that I was really eager to ask, is it true that you once warmed up for the Prodigy?
Yeah. So in fact, I think a couple of times. I used to DJ mainly in clubs and colleges, but I used to do some work at festivals as well. So I DJ'd in between the bands at festivals. And I remember there was one year the Prodigy were on at the V Festival, and I was sort of the main stage DJ. So I played the tunes before the Prodigy came on that evening, which was fun.
Wow.
And I think who else were on that weekend? I think Blur were the other headliners that particular year, but I used to do it most years. I'd do the main stage there. Wow.
I mean, it's quite a difference, I suppose. I mean, some would argue that live entertainment and being an MP are both, I suppose, entertainers ultimately. But I can see kind of a correlation. But so were you still DJing when you were a city councillor?
Yeah. I had a kind of double life for a long time. So I was a kind of respectable citizen in the day, and then I would go and DJ in like I say, mostly in clubs in Manchester or around sort of the north, so Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool, and beyond actually. So yeah, I had to kind of double life. It was fun. I mean, I've always been lucky to work in things that I am interested in. So the big sort of passions in my life are music and politics, and I've been lucky to be able to earn a living doing both.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, few people get the opportunity to live one dream, I suppose, but simultaneously get both. And they'd be so quite opposite ends of the spectrum, really. So a lot of people, I think, would consider them to be polarized. When they think of your cliched sort of typical politician, they are suited and booted and what's the term? Sort of stick up the arse, as it were. But they wouldn't then expect them to be throwing down beats on a nightclub after sitting in a chambers discussing potholes and right of way, you know?
Indeed. Although I think that's a good thing about Parliament, actually, is that people think it's full of sort of lawyers and ex-political advisors and that sort of thing. And there are plenty of those people. But the good thing about Parliament is that there are people from all sorts of backgrounds. So there's, social workers, miners, and one DJ. But, there are people from all sorts of walks of life, really. And that is important and a valuable thing about it, I think.
Mm. No,
it does give me a sort of perspective to take into Parliament that maybe lots of other people don't have, which is why I got involved in some of the things I've been involved in Parliament, like sort of supporting the nighttime economy and things like drug policy as well.
No, yeah, I can see the correlations, and exactly that is from lived experience. I think that we advocate and fight hardest, and so having the broadest spectrum brush with which to paint the picture of our society, just increases the general diversity of the outcome. Yeah, I think we need far more DJs. This is my official call to DJs out there. When the nighttime economy is in a little bit of trouble, they're trying to solve it, but it's going to be a little while. So maybe go into politics. good transition career there.
Yeah. And I'm too old for the DJing as well by now. So
now I suppose that answers one of my later questions, which would you consider making a comeback?
No, I think the problem is when I was a DJ, you have to, to do it properly, you have to treat it seriously and do it like a full-time job almost, and spend a lot of time kind of going to clubs or looking around for music, searching for new music, and I just don't have the time to do that nowadays. And to be honest, since I got elected to Parliament in 2015, I have no idea what's been happening musically, to be honest. So I could do you a good retro night, but not. I'm not up to speed with things. So
I suppose with Partygate, you weren't invited to DJ.
No, I wasn't invited to any of the parties in Downing Street.
It's a shame they've missed a trick there. They've really missed a trick. Especially they're talking about local jobs and stimulating the economy. Got one of their own in-house they could have hired right there.
Indeed, yeah. For a price, although it'd be a high price for me to DJ a Tory party.
Yeah, very high price. We're not just talking about financial, I guess, here. So it was, I guess, a natural transition from city councillor to MP, because we were a city councillor in the constituency as well.
Yeah, I was. So I was a councillor for a long time, for 18 years, actually, and was quite happy doing that, and had some sort of, I suppose, serious responsible jobs on the council in Manchester. So I was in charge of education and children's services for 4 years, and then I did a 4-year term as the executive member for finance, it's called. It's a bit like being the chancellor for the city of Manchester. So I did those 2 jobs. And so
I was going to say, so you were in charge of potholes and right away.
Yeah, and lots of other things. So yeah, it does prepare you. It's a very similar sort of a experience to being an MP. And yeah, I was councillor for one of the local wards in my constituency where that I represent now. So it's an area that I grew up in actually and know well. So it's a relatively natural transition. I think I knew what to expect going into Parliament, maybe more than some people who going from different backgrounds.
Yeah, I suppose exactly that. You've had nearly 2 decades of lived experience of the procedural, the mundane aspects of governing, of ruling. And I think that is, politics shouldn't be so sexy and glamorous. I'm bored of this attempts to make it so. I mean, yeah, you can add certain attributes and traits to any individual and people can espouse them and portray them. But I think then just trying to find sexy politicians to deal with, like I said, potholes with education and whatever else, these are not such sexy subjects. We need people that have done the legwork, so like yourself, that have actually then boots on the ground. You know what I mean? It's all well and good coming in with ideas, but if you haven't had then 15 years of going, well, actually, this is what happens when you try and do that.
Yeah. And it's about striking the balance. But it's also important to go into politics with ambition and wanting to change things and wanting to make things better and making your area better as well as the country. So it's striking the balance. I suppose the other thing, about having experience in a council or other political settings, you sort of know how things are done, and hopefully that will give you an idea about what levers there are to push, to pull, and you sort of understand how to get things done a little bit better. You said that politics is Parliament is a strange place, and so it's a unique experience going there in itself.
I bet I've protested outside of it many times with cannabis plants in hand and big placards. And as I said, we'll sort of get onto that momentarily. So one of the things that I was quite interested about was you became an MP and pretty fast you admitted to previous drug consumption, and you quietly championed the legalization of cannabis and the decriminalization of drugs like ecstasy, which is something you don't often see an MP doing, let alone a lone MP. I was going to say, in the realm of politics, what kind of drove you to such madness? I respect it as a citizen, but in that realm, that's kind of a no-no. A lot of your peers more than likely have, and frankly, as we're seeing by investigations, still do. But what made you so bold at such a time?
It was one of the things I wanted to do going into Parliament because, as I say, I had probably a slightly different perspective than some other MPs and different experiences, and you bring those experiences to your life in Parliament. And quite early, I decided it was one of the issues I wanted to speak up on, because mainly because not many people do, for the reasons that you mentioned. Now, I don't have massive ambitions on being in the cabinet or anything like that, so it's not like I have a need to be cautious to protect my future career necessarily. So, I mean, I want to be involved and do good things within my party and within Parliament, but I also think it's important to speak up on issues that other people don't. And I say that, but actually more and more MPs are starting to discuss this as an issue, and there's always been a handful. I think the handful is getting slightly bigger each sort of intake of Parliament, and people who sort of maybe have slightly more liberal views and more experience and are willing to at least talk about this as an issue. So that, I think, is a good thing. Although it's still, as you rightly note, is a minority. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, unfortunately, of a lot of the new uptake, which is, again, something we'll kind of circle back to later on, seem to have, or at least on the surface, vested interests in them making such public statements or allying themselves to such grassroots sort of movements.
Maybe. I mean, I think some of the new Tory intake are maybe less small and liberal than even some of their peers, and so
far more neo, less liberal.
And so that's maybe not encouraging, but they're in some of those red wall seats that maybe we might win back at some point soon.
Good answer. Politician's answer. I like it. So one of the things I wanted to ask, how many bars are there in Westminster? You say it's a weird place. I heard 12 at one point, and I quoted it in the past, but I seem to feel that's quite high.
Well, the parliamentary estate is quite a massive place, and so it does have lots of sort of outlets, lots of eating areas, cafeterias, that sort of thing. I think there are sort of two main bars as such. I mean, to be honest, I don't spend a lot of time in the bars at Parliament, so I don't know them all. But there are two that are actual like what I suppose you'd call normal bars with pumps and that sort of thing, beer pumps. And then there are sort of other rooms where you can get a bottle of wine or whatever. I have no idea, if I'm being honest with you, how many there are. I suspect that figure of 12 might include the sort of dining rooms where you get served wine with your food sort of thing. So I don't think there certainly aren't a dozen bars just waiting to be.
Yeah, it's not like a night crawl. You can't start in one and just work your way through the 12.
No, indeed, no. I think the night crawl would be two in Parliament.
Yeah, saying that, we are waiting for, I suppose, the finer details of a Met investigation. So who knows what's going on? Who knows? Obviously, if individuals like yourself are not sort of imbibing at work, which again, it's the reason I asked is that I'm just interested in the correlation of what we're starting to understand about sort of mass alcohol consumption and its effects on things like, say, empathy, on rational thinking. And yeah, so it's just, I was just sort of curious as to, as I inform this opinion, and obviously I write a lot of blogs and whatever else, I wanted to kind of get it from the horse's mouth, as it were. But I suppose you'll be one source amongst many now, so I'm guessing I'm going to have to find an MP that does enjoy a little bar crawl.
I think there's always been a sort of culture in Parliament of a little bit of drinking. I'm not sure it's any worse now than it always has been, probably perhaps less so. And you know, you go down to the bar in the evening. There are people sort of waiting around for the final vote kind of thing, or having a drinks. But there's to be honest, there's always been that, and I don't think most people don't spend their day in the bar. They sort of retire there after the day's activities and the votes are finished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think tactful answers. Appreciate that. So one of the things that obviously you can maybe get a comment on, there's been a few investigations over the years. One of Rupert Murdoch's favourite rags has done a couple where they found cocaine inside the toilets in Parliament. They recently actually found methamphetamine in one of the Home Office toilets.
Really?
Yeah. So I was just wondering about if you had a comment on that in general, given sort of your previous experience, because again, it's I know you're going to have to respond as a sitting MP right now, but obviously you've had the life that you've had. So I was just curious how those two worlds kind of merge into a response to this.
I'm not sure they do particularly. I think it's like any big workplace. I mean, there are several thousand people work in Parliament. You go to any big workplace, and you swab the toilets. It's not going to be unusual necessarily to find substances that shouldn't be there. I certainly don't think it's Parliament is a place that's rife with cocaine or drug taking generally. But I guess the sort of the MPs and peers are only one section of the people who are there, and in that respect, it'd be like most other workplaces. There will be some consumption.
I suppose it is best to frame that, I suppose, to rationalise it in that, the MPs and the peers are what, 650 amongst several thousand, as you were saying? Well,
the 650 MPs is about 800 peers, actually. But most of them aren't, a lot of them aren't working peers. So you can probably say there's like 1,000 people on the estate of legislators, but there are thousands of people who work in the various offices and support services. So,
okay, that makes sense. And I suppose actually as well, if you had one individual consuming drugs and use different toilets over different days, you would get residue appearances. So I suppose one person's rather large indulgence and habit, I suppose, could make it look like several. Yeah. Okay. One of the things I wanted to ask as well, I suppose, is you're involved in a few of the all-party parliamentary groups. Always struggle to say that. One of them is that you're the chair of co-chair. I'm trying to read my notes here. Co-chair of the Humanistic group. Yeah. Are you a humanist?
I am. Yeah. And again, when I joined Parliament, that was one of the areas that I think I am interested in supporting, really, I suppose, because Parliament is there's a lot of religion in Parliament. So we say prayers before every session every day.
Wow.
And if you're not in for prayers, I don't go in for prayers because I don't believe in it. But if you're going for prayers at the start of the day, you get a pick of the seats effectively, without going into the details. So that's kind of not unfair. And there's lots of references, glory be to God on the above the door as you go in, sort of thing. And lots of my MP colleagues have faith and express that sometimes in debates and put that sort of opinion forward. And I think it's important to have a balance from people like myself who don't have any faith. And so it's just one of those things that I thought would be a useful thing to do. And these all-party parliamentary groups, they are, as they say, all-party. And the idea is that you kind of come together to discuss issues of concern and take action on things that you're interested in, without necessarily the kind of adversarial approach that we have in the parliamentary chamber. So it's trying to bring people together to discuss these sorts of issues. So there are MPs from all parties. Excuse me, in the APPGs, and we generally speaking sort of work together quite effectively and quite amenably, really.
Yeah, I imagine so, because it would sort of division down secular lines, I suppose, then often leads to sort of the bipartisan nature of reality. Once you believe so much, you kind of corner yourself off to something, and then you by default create an opposition to somebody else's belief, and then you have to create either commonality or sort of an acceptance and of each of the sort of faith. Whereas if you get, I think the humanist approach, I mean, one of the first public talks I did about cannabis was to Durham Humanist Society, and about 20 of them, they invited us around to a house, sat on a big square, and they basically went, pictures on cannabis. I was like, all right. And everything I went with, and I just literally went through everything I'd ever learned. And I was just pulling it all off the cuff as much as I could. I brought loads of resources, physical things for them to touch. And the one thing they kept coming back to was evidence. And what I learned about humanists is they don't really care at all for belief, for dogma. It is entirely about what can you show. And I think that it was one of the things I always found interesting is sort of your opinion on drugs and then a humanist ideology versus Parliament's general attitude towards drugs. It's not a bipartisan issue. You know, all the major parties, I mean, even the Greens, they're quite hella liberal compared to most of the others, but it's still not quite where a lot of people would want progressive drug policies to be.
You know, that's absolutely right. And our drug policy has not been evidence-based for decades, and that's part of the problem. And one of the things we do argue for, because I'm co-chair of the all-party group on drug policy reform, and so one of the things, the two things we say is we want our drug policy to be focused on harm reduction and evidence-based, and they're the two things. And if we could just get to that position, we'd be making a lot of progress.
Interesting. I was speaking to I had Dana Larson on recently. He's a Canadian activist, really influential. I don't know if you sort of know him. He opens and runs the Coca Leaf Cafe in Vancouver, the medicinal mushroom dispensary, medicinal cannabis dispensary. So we were talking, and we came up with a term. We said we were bored of hearing evidence-based harm reduction policies. We want evidence-based benefit maximization policies. Because all of these drugs have benefits. There's a reason we all continue to consume them. It helps slightly reframe the argument, because yes, we need harm reduction, but harm reduction comes alongside the maximization of a benefit, because to maximize a benefit, you surpass just reducing its harm. You start to sway attention towards and focus towards what it can potentially do, not just for the consumer, for the economy, for the ecology, for the environment. You know, it's when we start to really scale it up beyond just that individual, they're choosing to do this thing. It's the argument I often have against decriminalization, in that, yes, it ends the end consumer being criminalized, but it does nothing for regulation of supply. It actually then most often incentivizes and creates really powerful cartels.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with that. That's an interesting approach, the benefit maximization approach. I would say, just in political terms, if we want to make a difference in changing policy in Parliament, that wouldn't be the focus. That wouldn't be the emphasis I would put on things, because I don't think we're quite there yet. I mean, I actually agree with you that there are lots of benefits from various drugs, but because we've had 50 years of drugs are bad, we've got to get to. I think the way to convince people is not to kind of say, oh, there are lots of great things about drugs, or it's our right to take drugs. The way to change minds in Parliament, politicians' minds, who are very cautious, is to say, well, we want to reduce harm and we want to save lives. And that's the approach I would take. I suppose it's a step-by-step approach, and I think that's the first step, which is why we've always focused in the drug policy groups that I'm in, we've focused really on that, because I think that's the most realistic way of making some change.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. And even Dana said that, he was like, look, even in Canada with where they were progressively a few years ago, we'll say that much, that would be a very difficult thing for any sitting politician to come out. And he's a serial, I can't remember what the term is, for people that run for office knowing they're never going to get in. And he does it just to kind of get on the ticket. And he's like, even for me doing that would be quite difficult. But again, it was just a nice way to, there's an ever-growing sector of society that, like, we're past that. We were there 10 years ago. We're looking at 10 years from now. And the other argument and the fear that I've got is of legalization becoming monopolization and the creation of huge conglomerates that internationally hold more power than the individual territories or regions. So instead of honoring legacy markets and the existing cultures, because ultimately I see once the war on drugs is over, it's the same as once we decriminalized homosexuality. we then have to start healing the wounds. You then have to start making allowances for that which has been done. So I've been pitching for, 5 years now, the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to coincide with the cessation of murder, that we need to review murder because it is not fit for purpose under this guise of basically, like I said, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So you get people out of prisons, you get people from all spectrums, you get people like Neil Woods, and there's a hell of a lot of people in elite from the UK judiciary that have got some strong opinions about what they have done to thousands of people in this country. And then we can start to create, again, evidence-based, quite humanist policies that will then, reduce the harms that have been inflicted on their lives in terms of the mental health consequences. And start to offer them remuneration to rebuild and, revitalize and restart their lives.
Remuneration is an interesting one. I'm not sure where you quite get it. I think, as I say, for me, it's a kind of step-by-step thing. And
this is step 25, by the way.
Yeah. Let's change some minds first so we get to step 3.
I always like to big dream. This is what's the point of this podcast. It's just me chatting shit for a couple of hours every week. So you're just this week's victim, Jeff. No, I'm thoroughly enjoying this. I think we're getting through these questions really well. I've got a couple more, and then we'll dive straight on into to cannabis. So I noticed that you do, is it 6 surgeries a month? Is that still?
Well, we have,
or did, I suppose COVID will have changed the way that operates.
Yeah, well, we had to stop all that during COVID. And actually, so what MPs generally want to do surgery or want to meet their constituents and want to try and help out. So something, I suppose 6 is a higher number than many, but that's what we were doing up until COVID. Now, when COVID came, we had to stop them all. And we were just starting to start up again, actually, when the MP, David Amos, was murdered at his surgery. So we got some advice just to not start again just yet. So we're still thinking about how we support our constituents. Now, we will be doing some advice surgeries, but actually what we've found in this changed world is that supporting people via Zoom, for example, is just as easy and very often quicker. So I think we'll see a lot more of that in future for MPs. So not so much I'll be in this place at 1:00 on Saturday, all come down and queue up to see me, but making appointments and being able to support people straight away and just have a conversation and then take on whatever their issue is. So the sort of changed world that we all had, we need to sort of learn from the new practices and the benefits that we've had from it, and that is one way forward, I think, for MPs.
Yeah, definitely. It was basically the question was going to be, and I realized as I was reading that out, obviously that it's not necessarily true, was sort of how to make your local MP and direct democracy sort of more accessible. And there's one thing I wanted to throw in that I read recently that keeps blowing my mind every time I think about it. Zoom and video conferencing during the lockdowns has had more of a benefit towards positive climate than all of the electric vehicles put together so far.
That's an interesting one. Yeah, I wonder if that's true.
It was I can't remember. I read it recently in one of the mainstream. I think it was Forbes or something like that. I'll try and find the source for this. That
is interesting. But actually, it has made engagement with groups easier. So I do now. I do a Zoom call every couple of months with the local Friends of the Earth. Well, actually, it's a group called The Time Is Now, and it's a sort of climate change lobby group. And so I do a Zoom with them. I do Zoom calls with local residents groups, with local school children. So it's actually made engagement with those sorts of groups a lot easier. So I probably, again, we'll make the most of these new ways of working. And I would never have been able to do, for example, the regular meetings with the climate change group that I do on Zoom.
And I suppose it would have, it adds to the climate change argument. Do you know what I mean? What you're doing is you're saving that money. I made the point during COPs that if just one of the international leaders had made a point of not attending and sent a Zoom screen, the power of that statement could have made towards, actually aligning values with actions on the global political scene.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting because you need to it's about getting a balance, and sometimes it does help to be in the same room with people and having private conversations off in the corridors and those sorts of things. So that kind of engagement that you don't, the kind of informal engagement that you wouldn't get with a Zoom call, So it's about striking the right balance and making the most of those.
Indeed. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I suppose, and let's delve into the bones of this. I suppose, we'll start thinking fast. What is medical cannabis, and is there a difference between it and cannabis?
Obviously, medical cannabis is derived from the cannabis plant. Now, obviously, it's not necessarily like smoking a joint or taking full plant cannabis, because some of the medical cannabis that is used has very little THC, for example, mainly CBD, and there are different products. What we know is that there is great potential in using cannabis in its various guises and its various, products and balance with THC and CBD for a number of conditions. And so that's why we refer to it as medical cannabis, I guess. And also, I think the fact that it is used as a medicine and can be treated as a medicine actually is another one of those things that helps to change people's perspective of it. And I've got people involved in the All Party group on medical cannabis who would never support legalizing recreational cannabis.
I respect and appreciate your answer. I'll be gentle with my deconstruction. So one of the things that I find obviously frustrating is it's a misnomer. I've worked quite hard with Mike Barnes and the Cannabis Industry Council in the UK, and they've recently voted and agreed to change their subgroup from medical cannabis to prescription cannabis, which in English more accurately sort of describes the situation. It is the prescription of cannabis, which is the medicinal use of cannabis, which is medicinal means medical use of, whereas medical cannabis is a misnomer to people. When they hear it, they then are thinking of it's something special, something separate, something different. At the minute, I think there's somewhere in the region of 1,250 to 1,300 prescriptions at the minute in the UK on private. There are 3 on NHS at the minute. Obviously, there were special allowances that were compensations for the very active national campaigns that obviously led towards movement on this. We're seeing an issue of juxtaposition between the access 3 years into this change of bill, the so-called medical cannabis access bill of 2018, which came into effect November 1st. So about 13,000 so-called patients versus the 1.4 million people that were speculated. We obviously have a system of something like CanCard, which isn't verified, isn't really backed by anything. We've recently had the Home Office come out against it. They lost a case in the Isle of Wight in the judiciary. I'm mixing up my acronyms here. The GP Association, the Royal College of GPs, have not backed this. Nursing College have backed away from it. So we've got this juxtaposition here. They've sold somewhere in the region, I think, 50,000 cards. So of that 1.4 million, somewhere of discretion of some we could call air quotes protection is still minute percentage of the total number of people that consume cannabis in this country for medicinal purposes. Mm-hmm. The issue that a lot of people have in the reform movement in the UK at the minute is that we stood outside of Parliament and supported one of your fellow MPs, Paul Flynn, the late Paul Flynn, rest in peace, in his work to get his motion tabled, which was a private member's bill, quite similar to the one that you've got in Parliament yourself at the minute. His was much more ambiguous, I guess, with the language, because we were promised in conversations with organizations at the time the right to self-identify, that we wouldn't need a third-party specialist to go, cannabis could benefit you. If you had previous experience, historic experience, you could self-identify and thus you would be able to be considered a medical patient. We were also then promised that conversations would be had around grow your own and around compassion clubs. And again, 3 years in, these haven't really materialized. We have more than a dozen private clinics, as I alluded to at the start of this, some of them tacitly and some of them more directly connected to active MPs in the House. And so, basically, I suppose I didn't mean to ask that question as a trap, but I kind of wanted to present both of our interpretations so that we can then move forward with the conversation.
Yeah. there's a lot wrapped up in what you just said. There was
a hell of a lot.
I suppose I try and focus on what we can achieve and what progress we can make. And so when, just as an example to the medical cannabis bill, I had, when I was drawn, the way this works, to get a private members bill, it's a lottery and you put your name in and so many people get drawn each session. Now, I got drawn and went, as soon as I decided that I think medical cannabis would be a good way to go forward, I tried to have conversations with the government about what they would accept in terms of a bill that would make progress. Now, obviously, they are going to be much more limited in what they will allow than the various ambitions that you and campaigners have. But it's kind of, one step at a time. How can we make some progress on this? So I had a number of conversations with ministers about what they might agree to in terms of a bill. Didn't really get anywhere, if I'm being honest, because they're very nervous about doing anything that isn't approved by what you might call the medical establishment. And so I couldn't agree anything. So I came up with a couple of proposals to go in the medical cannabis bill, which would have been, sort of baby steps along the way of making progress. But I just think we have to focus on what might be achievable. And the things I put forward, I thought were not unreasonable asks, but the government wouldn't have them anyway. But yeah, I was trying to focus on how we can make a little bit of progress in what is still a relatively difficult environment to talk about drugs, which is, Parliament is not a place where necessarily everybody wants to talk about drug policy.
Yeah, ironic, even some of the points that we've already made in this conversation. So from my crude understanding of the proposal of your bill, it's effectively to move on from specialists to allow GP prescribing.
Yeah, well, yeah, but within a limited framework. So the two proposals in my bill, one was that we create a commission to look at the evidence for medical cannabis now on different conditions. Now, currently, the government, the MHRA and NICE and the people who authorise treatments very much focus on randomised controlled trials for approval of new medicines. And when I speak to some of the experts in the field, so I'm no expert on psychopharmacology, but when I speak to the experts, they tell me that randomised controlled trials are not really appropriate for whole plant cannabis. And so we need to look at different ways, other ways of building an evidence base that supports using cannabis for a number of conditions. So my bill, the first part of my bill was to create a commission to look at the evidence around the UK and around the world and build up an evidence base that isn't just about randomized controlled trials. So looking at the real world evidence and then to make recommendations or proposals from that. So that was one half of it. And then the other half was to create a register of GPs trained in prescribing cannabis as a medicine. Now, they wouldn't be necessarily for things like for conditions like treatment-resistant epilepsy, they're quite complex, difficult conditions that you need to be an expert on, a consultant in. But there are plenty of conditions that people come forward with to GPs, for example, chronic pain and things like that are sort of GP conditions, and a GP would be able to prescribe a treatment for, and that could include cannabis and to create a database of trained GPs. Now, the government wouldn't allow that either. The government then, the reason they gave to me was they said, well, we don't want a load of GPs to be able to prescribe because they'll come under pressure to prescribe cannabis for recreational purposes. And which I think is a red herring personally, but that's the reason that they gave for not supporting my bill. So they were the two things I wanted to do: was create a commission to look at the evidence and get a register of trained GPs.
It's interesting because both of those things, I mean, you don't have to comment on this, but both of those things, in my opinion, will have been shot down because they're against Tory ideology. us then creating GP access and a service of access for cannabis, the largest growing global medicine at the time when opioid production is being moved into a very dangerous classification, because we're understanding things like fentanyl and now carfentanil and how they're working and worming their way into so-called sort of recreational or adult supply drugs. So that's an antithesis of their ideology. Oh, no, God, I got a really bad feedback there. Sorry. An antithesis to their kind of ideology there. And then on the other side of this is that knowledge. That knowledge already exists. Google GW patents and look at all of the cannabinoids for treatments of. There's a reason all companies like this, they were recently bought for £5.4 million by Jazz Pharmaceuticals out of Ireland. Now, a month ago, they announced, I think the number I saw was American, so I can't do the math. It was a $100 million facility in Kent. So whatever that calculates out in pounds. So on one hand, they're allowing the proliferation of corporation invested interests like this to do what they do. And obviously, guys, you can go look at the Philip Robson Commission, the Royal Commission that led to the creation of GW and the shelving of his paper into the psychiatric bill, psychiatric part of the Lancet. Very worth looking at in terms of the recommendation for decriminalization and the immediate creation of basically exactly what Jeff is now saying, which is a database to then create prescribing and access for the medicinal use of cannabis. And that red herring, it's the same one we're seeing that has created this false binary and polarization in cannabis, which is that CBD good, THC bad, CBD non-psychoactive, THC very psychoactive, when CBD is psychoactive. You ask anybody that actually knows and isn't just selling CBD, the reason we call it non-psychoactive is so it can sit in that little wellness bracket between regulatory systems at the minute. Obviously, vested interest in the CMC and the ACI and other organizations pushed very heavily to now get the FSA involved. There's a lot of acronyms. I'm sorry if you don't know those acronyms, people. So we then create all this muddled system where doing that would empower the people, would empower the consumer, whereas the system that seems to be created here in the UK over the past 25 years, if you look at it through the actions of the Home Office, through the actions of the various constabularies, through the actions of various consecutive governments, it's to create private access and enterprise around currently criminalized substances while still criminalizing the people that gave them the evidence and the data for this. The other side of that, look at patents, is look at the people. There's millions of us consume it every day that can tell you, I used to consume XYZ drug. I used to have this diagnosis. I used to this. I used to that. We have to at some point understand that real world anecdotal data, when it gets to hundreds of thousands of people, maybe should be taken into consideration when making, again, evidence-based rational decisions around drug policy.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I call for this commission. I mean, I don't deny that in terms of medical products, randomized double-blind randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. That if you can achieve that in testing a new product, that's great. But if that sort of trial is not appropriate for the in this case the plants that you're using, then you need to look at other evidence. Yeah, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another sort of. One I wanted to pick up on before that you said in your introduction, I suppose, of what medical cannabis is, again, air quotes, medical cannabis is, in your understanding of this balanced THC CBD. So Mike Barnes is someone that I've been quite close to in this for a long time. I invited him down to one of our very first events here in Durham, and we stood in a field and debated about psychosis, at which point, after which we both kind of shook hands when that was a really good conversation. Let's go do some more research. And we've messaged back and forth and had these conversations since. I've had him on twice now on the podcast and asked him, does the medical profession, does prescribers of cannabis worry about cannabis psychosis? Do they worry about this skunk psychosis narrative that has been proliferated in the British press for the past 15 years? And ultimately, it doesn't seem to be cropping up. They're not seeing any forms of psychosis inside of their prescribing. So there's two things that most of us are considering. One is obviously about 75% of Europeans, including UK citizens, mix their cannabis with tobacco. Tobacco, we know, to have a casual sort of relationship towards temporary psychosis and psychosis type events. And the other side is obviously adulterants within the cannabis. So one of the arguments that a lot of people are putting forward is the only difference between a medical product and a a product you can buy on the street should be the stringent steps and regulations that goes through. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. And I mean, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychopharmacologist, so I'm not an expert, but I'm happy to. Well, I know about Mike Barnes pretty well, and he's somebody whose judgment I very much trust on this. Yeah, I mean, we need to gather the evidence, which is another reason, for a commission.
Yeah, I've got an interesting one for you. Because this is actually, I'm a writer there's a sly plug being in the bottom corner of here, folks, of a Weed World magazine. I'm a writer for a few magazines, and I've got sort of a website. And one of the pieces I'm writing at the minute is I'm currently in my friend's spare room. I've been made homeless because I grew my own cannabis. Past tense now, because I'm currently can't. And it was made insecure by a neighbor revealing my situation. And so one of the things I'm looking at is how prohibition affects mental health. So you being obviously then one of the members of the APPG on mental health, there's a lot of correlation between your humanist, your drug policy, and the mental health there. I think there needs to be some crossover and consideration to, because a lot of the patients and people that you're seeking to improve the access to, they're currently growing for themselves. I mean, I wouldn't self-identify as a patient because I feel it would muddy those waters. I consume cannabis. Do you know what I mean? I don't necessarily want to get involved in that conversation. I'll have that conversation with my doctors and will continue to do so. But I'm not interested to be prescribing, because I don't want a third party professional telling me what to do. In the same way, I can get a dietitian in, but I'm also free to go to the shop and buy food. I could kill myself on McDonald's in a couple of years by getting diabetes, obesity, and various other sort of complications resulting in that relationship. And so I think that a lot of those patients and people just want the right to be left alone, to not be criminalized, they want to give that data and information to the doctor to help others that do want that access. But they don't want the fear of then the doctor taking it the wrong way. I've heard horror stories in this country over the past few years of the DVLA being contacted and licenses being removed, of child services being contacted to have home visits to check on the safety of children. And these are the kind of things that are going to stop people self-reporting and building and informing that evidence base. That, I mean, I'll slyly note here when I looked at your voting record is that you're quite for data collection. So we need the data collection on this to move forward. And that means we have to not criminalize, demonize, or ostracize the individuals that are trying to provide that information.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah. And going back to the first bit about mental health, and we need to understand the evidence. If there may be some links between high THC consumption and psychosis, and we need to understand that. Equally, we need to also understand that in terms of treatment for mental health conditions, currently illegal drugs can be helpful. If you look at some of the work that's been done with psilocybin, with even MDMA. There's very interesting work going on about, in particularly trauma and post-traumatic stress with those drugs, and we need to understand the benefits, as you said earlier on.
Yeah. But does this not create in some way a form of drug exceptionalism? Because currently, so one of the people I'm currently hitting to try and, I'm not going to name him actually because I'm still trying to nail him down as a guest. But basically in this country right now, so we had a big thing. You're obviously a music lover. You've enjoyed festivals. I enjoyed Boomtown for 7 years in a row. Just went at it every year. It was like, I love this place. This is a wonderful escapism. Everybody just being kind of eating a stick and free and just enjoying themselves. There was a big problem with ketamine for a few years. Ketamine, obviously class C, has now been, I think, up to a class B. For about $6,000, you can get ketamine infusions. So you can go to a clinic and you can go and get ketamine infused into your veins intravenously, go through it with guided therapy, and there are other parts to it. I'm oversimplifying. But then on the other side of that is the person that is being then targeted by the police because they're a little bit slow. They may be wearing dirty clothes in an area that's, I don't know, somewhere like Bristol or wherever, that has a free party culture, that has that kind of vibrant culture, that are then being targeted. And it creates this, like I said, drug exceptionalism, and it reinforces institutional classism, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I don't think criminalizing people for using drugs helps anybody. And I don't think the police spending a lot of time doing that is a good use of their resources. And that's, that's one of the reasons we argue for a different approach in Parliament to focus on harm reduction rather than criminalising people.
Is there much of a crossover? Because one of the things that I'm looking at the minute is intersectionality between various sort of activist groups and organisations and communities. Does that occur in that culture naturally in Westminster? Are there, say, people within policing that are actively having these conversations? Because I know obviously file and rank, you can't speak out of line, as it were. But privately, I've spoken to a lot of police, some former heads of police. Obviously, I've got podcasts with Arthur Jones. I mean, I had a good working relationship with our previous chief constable, and some of the things he said to me in private, were like, man, you're a human. I see your uniform, and I hear that sometimes. But hearing them as the person inside of that, and I think that the restrictions of the nature of office sometimes can make it quite difficult to have these conversations. But as you alluded to before, the conversations that occur in private chambers and quietly after events and whatever, is there this commingling between these various subgroups?
There's not a huge amount of it. I mean, the people who tend to come to the events we run and tend to come to our meetings are maybe the people who are interested already and making those arguments already. So Arthur's a good voice of reason in these issues. There's a guy called Jason Q who's worth talking to, who was running policeman in Thames Valley, but very kind of progressive in his thinking, and he used to come along to our meetings. So we'd have those conversations with enlightened people within law enforcement, but I think they tend to be people who are coming along out of their own interest anyway. So I'm not sure there's that many, if I'm being honest with you, I'm not sure there's that many other conversations with representatives of law enforcement going on between, certainly I'm not party to a lot of them.
It's a shame, because there's an interesting mechanism that I want to put to you that one of my activist friends always goes on about. And he says that currently, by police enforcing the war on drugs, they are actively harming their pensions, because it's creating one of the largest deficits of personal debt in the UK is council tax debt. A lot of people offset council tax. If you consume cannabis, it is a hell of a lot cheaper to cultivate it yourself and keep yourself away from criminalization, keep yourself out of the illicit market, and then trade to other friends as a way to then offset other costs. But then the enforcement of this then forces people into other petty criminality, forces people into small consumption, so they're having to buy individual deals, which means it requires scale. Again, class comes into this, a hell of a lot more money for a lot less product. Whereas before, if they can provide for themselves in one crop, they've got a year. So then once they destroy this, you then end up with a deficit of people paying council tax because they've got money that needs to go out to other areas if they have a habit, whatever the substance is, not just cannabis here. So then what we're seeing from, I think there's 9 forces now out of the 43 in England and Wales that have these checkpoint diversion schemes. Obviously Durham, big up Durham, one of the first to kick it off. And what they're seeing, or the data that's coming back from that isn't necessarily being highlighted heavily, is that a soft touch approach is actually creating liquidity in local markets. So instead of creating a hyper competitive market for dealers and for consumers, that if they allow the people that are safe supply, the people that are not breaking legs for 10 bags, then inquisitive crime drops. Council tax rates, like I said, is going up. So it then offsets ultimately where these monies and divestments into various avenues of public service occur.
I'm not sure I follow the link to police pensions, but I get the link between wasted resources, I guess.
Yeah, but it's just like I said, in terms of the more money in the hands of the people, the more that then is paid into tax, the more that then tax is broken down into service then goes ultimately into to pensions.
Okay.
So that's
I think we waste a lot of money, I suppose, on criminalising people who don't need to be criminalised.
Entirely. So I suppose I've got a few more questions because I'm aware of the time, if it's all right to just grab a couple.
Yeah.
So I suppose one of the things I noticed while doing the research for yourself was sort of your father's history within trade union movement, and was just wondering your thoughts on the creation of a cannabis trade union here in the UK, because there is obviously already several hundred, if not probably a couple of thousand different companies and organizations, but there is no real representation for them on a political level. Whereas if they had a trade body movement, they could easily start to rank several, if not dozens of thousands of members that could then, use their voting power to start to lean heavier on various political parties.
Well, I think the two different things. You've got a trade union, which is about representing the workers in a particular sector, and then you've got trade representative bodies. So you might be looking at something like there's this Cannabis Industry Council that Mike Barnes is involved in, and there are starting to be a number of organisations that bring cannabis producers together or cannabis advocates together, which is fine. But I think that's a different thing to sort of trade unionism, if you like, which is about.
But that's what I'm saying, is that those companies, they're getting together themselves to help formulate and create this nascent industry. Yeah. But there's still then thousands of workers that then have no rights because there isn't been a blueprint or a framework for these industries to exist yet. So you can use traditional kind of employee rights and whatever else, but actually the skills and services that are being provided by people in this new sector are far more valuable than they are currently being paid for, and they do not have a voice, a body, an organization to stand against this. If you are a grower, you can't really fight against the body of GW or whoever else, because they've got 10 to the one of the dozen, whatever the expression is, people banging their door down of horticulturalists straight out of university dying to grow cannabis.
I think again you have to sort of split off the people who are just doing things on their own at home and people who work in a sector for a company, and the people who are in a sector working for a company, I'd say join a union. You don't have to wait for a specific trade union for people who work in the cannabis industry. There are lots of unions out there who will represent people in all kinds of industries.
Good to know. I would have assumed that there'd be some form of sort of stigma within some of them.
Excuse me. I think it depends on what the job is, but most trade unions are up for supporting workers in a variety of sectors.
Yeah, true. I suppose otherwise you wouldn't be a trade union. What are your thoughts on compassion clubs and sort of social access? Because at the minute, as we're saying, there is a real issue with people that are self-identifying that or believe and have previous experience that cannabis will help reduce the symptoms or help treat their condition, but they can't get a verification through the health system. So what are your sort of opinions on the creation, because there already are quite a lot of them around the country, these alternative access models?
Yeah, and I understand why people are doing that. And while people are unable to get prescriptions on the NHS, it's I think it's a perfectly understandable way of approaching it, and I don't have a problem with people who are doing that, because it's partly politicians' fault for not and the sort of medical establishment sort of not sorting this problem so people can get the access they need.
So what's your thoughts then on individual patients, whether they either self-identify or have a prescription, growing their own at home?
I'm not sure I'd want to get into that, because I think lots of people do that anyway, don't they, of course. But if you've got a prescription, for example, for a particular product with a particular balance, you're not necessarily going to get that by growing it at home, just by growing a plant. So if your prescription is for Epidiolex, say, which has a very low THC, for example, you're not going to get that by just growing your own plant. So I just think people have to be careful, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
I mean, I've obviously had quite a few guests on recently. I'll link them in the description below for the folks at home, with Kyle Esplen, actually, just last episode of last week, and with who's colloquially known as CBD James. And what we're finding from testing of these products that are being provided as the CBPMs here in the UK is that they are varying wildly. So a lot of the floral products and oil products are actually out by several percentage points. Mm-hmm. A lot of the marketability of them going, we've got 0.4% CBD or 4% CBD. They're finding that it's closer to 0.4% CBD in a lot of these products, that they are almost being created to navigate the current legislation to be able to provide profitability for international conglomerates. They're basically making whatever product sells. They are looking internationally at each country, looking at the legislation, figuring out how to, like I say, navigate it to create that the maximization of profit from that product. And as you were saying before about matching, there's probably a much wider potential capability of people to access through seed catalogs, a much wider diversity of profiles of cannabis ratios. These days, there's some unbelievable geneticists that have worked obviously from what we colloquially call hemp or low THC industrial strains of cannabis, cultivars of cannabis, and being able to create 1-for-1s, being able to create high ratioed CBD plants and products. I understand obviously your hesitance of commenting on this is a conversation. I just wanted, I guess, the opportunity to provide you with a little bit further information there. So I suppose we've got a couple more quick questions. Can you tell us about the Labour campaign for drug policy reform and how come it ended up almost identically with Crispin Blunt creating the Conservative drug policy reform group?
Well, so what happened was that myself and another Labour MP called Thangham Debonaires MP in Bristol both have similar. We're both members of the all-party group on drug reform, and both felt that there's never really been a place within the Labour Party to talk about drug policy, and we wanted to create just a space for people to do that and to come to meetings or to have online conversations about how we address our approach to drug policy. And there's never been a space in the Labour Party for that. So it was very much an kind of an informal thing that in Thangham set up and started to get more and more people involved in. And we were supported by a charity to sort of run it. And Thangham's had to step back. I'm having to step back a little bit. But the idea is just to do that, just to give people a space to talk about drug policy generally, and how, what the Labour Party's approach to drug policy should be. And it's about changing minds in the sort of medium term, and giving people a space to sort of develop that thinking. So we did that, and ours is very much a kind of informal grouping. So Crispin is my co-chair. He's a Tory co-chair of the all-party group on drug policy reform, Crispin Blunt. So he saw me and Thangham set up this Labour group and thought, well, that's a good idea. With the Conservatives should have a similar group. And so he set up a thing called the Conservative Party Drug Reform Group Limited, I think it's called. And it's a slightly different approach that he's got. It's a private company, but I think with a similar sort of approach, a similar sort of idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, any space that I guess can be created privately for MPs to discuss these things without fear of ramification from, I guess a lot of it is still this idea of the purse clutching Daily Mail reading granny that's a little bit like, oh my God, drugs. When paradoxically, actually, her arthritis, her hip pain, the fact she can't sleep, that she's constipated from all her opioids. I could go on for an hour of the ways that it could benefit. It's that juxtaposition is so palpable and painful to me as a person that is as informed as I am. I suppose then, what is, I guess, the likelihood? I mean, I'll admit to being a Corbynite. I'm Northern through and through, so I bleed red. I can't help it. You know what I mean? There's just something in us, in the water, in our blood, basically, as well. So I stepped away from politics for quite a while. I was very disenfranchised and disillusioned by the whole Iraq war. I suppose I should mention then, finding on your record that you kind of voted against an investigation. We'll leave it at that. I'd maybe like to discuss that privately with you. Or
did I? I don't remember whether I did. I don't think I did.
It's on my list of anti. It's on my list of anti. You also, I'll give you some points though. You're anti-Trident. That's some good. That's some good. So, or at least your record shows this. I'm happy to send you the link of my research of this after the fact to check with the record, because I would prefer to obviously have this correct at the time of it going out. But yes, my point, I think, before I got confused with that, is that
the way I was at the time arguing when Iraq happened, I was arguing against the Iraq war.
I think it was a 2016 vote for an investigation or somewhere in that time.
I can't remember the details of what was proposed that day, but there may have been a reason why I didn't do the right thing to support at the time. I don't know.
It was only a tie-in because, like I said, it was about that time that I really got disenfranchised with mainstream politics, stepped away for quite a while, and sort of ended up in activism and all of this stuff anyway. And then, Corbyn really was a big Corbynite, not going to lie. You know what I mean? Few issues, I guess, over his lifetime and his body of work that I would disagree with, but collectively his integrity and his direction and vision, I think, was something that set a fire amongst the youth and amongst the disenfranchised left and far left in the UK. We now find ourselves, obviously, with, I'm not going to sir him, but Keir Starmer. I'm not going to obviously try and trap you into an opinion or anything, but I just want to sort of get your thoughts on where we stand with the Labour Party's goals on moving forward with drug policy under Keir Starmer, who, given obviously his previous employment, but also his comments that he's made on the record since becoming Labour Party leader.
Well, my overriding purpose as a Labour MP is we need to form a Labour government. And, we can talk about all sorts of issues, cannabis being one, drug policy being one, all sorts of other issues. But if we're not in government, we can't make a difference to anything. So the most important thing we do is get an electable party that can form a government. And then if from that point, if we can change policy and have a more progressive drug policy when we're in government, then fine. But my absolute number one aim over the next few years is to get a Labour government, and I think Keir Starmer is the right person to try and lead us into forming a government. And so I support Keir. I voted for him when he stood for leader, and I want him to be Prime Minister. And at some point, we will have conversations about policy and other things that we disagree with, but we're all academic unless we can get into government.
Indeed. I think one of the things that I would hope to, I guess, impress on you through this conversation, I'd ideally obviously like to keep this conversation going further forward, sort of privately. But I think one of the things I'd like to sort of impress is the body of my work that I'm learning through this is the intersectionality of drug policy and cannabis prohibition and the prohibition of current substances, and the demonization basically of the most disenfranchised and most marginalized in this country. It is interconnected with everything. You want to deal with homelessness, you look at drug policy. You want to deal with ecology, look at drug policy. You want to deal with environmental sustainability, again, look at drug policy. Future-proof in the NHS, drug policy. Look at, we really, the needs, in my opinion, to be, there's good we have these APPG groups, but there almost needs to be an overarching group of just visionaries, people who are not looking to the next electoral cycle, people that are in that house because they want to die in that house, because they want to serve the people of this country. I believe that there must be some in there. You've said there's 1,000 of these, basically. Some of you must be all right. You've kind of won my vote privately, personally, in this conversation, because I respect the way you've come on and you've conducted yourself and you've had this conversation.
You'd be surprised there are quite a lot of them that are all right. Most people who go into politics go into it for the right reasons. They just want to make a difference to their community or to the country. Even the Tories, my personal disagreements and political disagreements with Tories, but lots of them, not Boris Johnson, but lots of them go into it for the right reasons, I think. And we may disagree about our solutions to the problems that the country faces, but I don't think they are necessarily in it for other reasons than wanting to do the right thing. So it's about having those conversations and those political debates and changing minds. Now, it just so happens that drug policy is one of the most difficult areas to do that, because we've had 50 years of the war on drugs. We need to, drugs are bad, and it's like turning a tanker is turning around the mindset that 50 years of propaganda has sort of established. So it's one of the harder things to do in terms of creating a consensus in Parliament. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are prepared to do it, and we'll have those difficult conversations.
All right, well then in that case, I'm not so begrudged that there are so many bars in Parliament, because a few drinks in, I suppose people get a bit big vision, you know. Oh, we should quit our jobs. We'll open a restaurant. I'm hoping that's maybe 5 or 6 drinks. I'm hoping 2 or 3 is them going, you know what? Maybe we can solve these problems. So yeah. All right, I do like to believe really do like to believe that there are, as I said, elements within these systems and apparatus. I started this many years ago with quite a anarchistic, burn it down, we'll live with whatever's left policy. And I kind of attached that and affixed it to everything in my life. And then kind of gone through many revolutions and evolutions and changes. Mainly a lot of that thanks to the intervention of some of the substances we've mentioned on this podcast. But since then, I understand now the need for procedures, for incremental change and for steps. But I also understand the need for radical revolution in conceptual ideals. Yeah. There needs to be a space for us to be able to have the big picture, and I need to draw that line in the sand over there for you to draw it here for us to meet in the middle. So I think anything we can do to further this discourse that creates, maybe steps away from the echo chamber that I think quite often, if nothing else, suffers from an intrinsic bit of classism around the discussion of drug policy. Because remember, a lot of drug consumers, in fact, the vast majority of demonized, criminalized, vilified drug consumers are on the lower economic side of the scale. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration when formulating policing strategy, when formulating benefits, especially at a time with gross inflation increases and everything else that's occurring on the cost of living. So I'm glad that there's individuals like yourself fighting for this. And like I said, I'm quite happy to pester you via email from now on. Going, hey, Jeff, you've seen this, check this out.
That's fine, yeah. I'm not the world's greatest expert, so I'm always willing to learn on these things.
Nice. Well, I'm more than happy to inform you. I'm not the greatest expert, but I have done a hell of a lot of reading over these years and will continue to do so.
Good.
All right, brilliant. Well, I want to thank you for you giving me a bit more of the time than was allotted. I've actually got my final question, which is it's the last question I ask everybody. What does the future hold for you? And I can already see this is going to be a politician's answer, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, excuse me. The future for me is trying to get a Labour government in the next couple of years. I would love to say that I'd love to think that in 2 years' time I might be a minister in a Labour government, but we shall see. And in terms of drug policy, we just keep bashing away, keep trying to change minds, and try and get people to focus on the evidence and on reality, other than propaganda.
Yep, great answers. Jeff, it has been a pleasure. You have slightly, let's say, rekindled my faith in mainstream politics here in the UK. So I appreciate that.
That's nice to hear, I guess. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it. And let's keep in touch.
You too. Enjoy your Easter, man.
Okay.
Peace.
Yes. See ya.
Bye. Well, folks, that was Jeff Smith, MP for Withington in Manchester. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I don't know if you that scramble of manic notes. Hence the reason I had to pull them off the wall halfway through, because I couldn't fucking read my own handwriting. I do actually have, this is a pros and antis list for where he voted. I will include the link for this in the description below. I'm going to remember to also email Jeff this afterwards. But yeah, sort of Jeff Smith MP, he is anti-fracking, which will do the things that I personally, I guess. So this is going to show my bias politically, I guess. The things that I would deem him to sort of be an all-right fella for. He is anti-fracking, anti all of this academies and all of the kind of education reform that's done in the UK that seems to ubiquitously have pissed off the entirety of the teaching profession. Like I said before during the recording, he's anti-Trident and the nuclear option, which I think is always a good stance to take. He is anti-peership, which I guess he kind of almost intimated as well when he spoke of the number and scale of them. He's against higher alcohol taxes. So all of my imbibing friends out there, I know there's still people that like to enjoy alcohol and will do so as they wish. There you go. He's anti putting higher taxes on you all folks. He was anti the Iraq investigation in 2016. He is pro-nationalisation and public ownership, which is something I wanted to ask him and didn't get opportunity. But we'll probably be able to drag him back, I'm sure. I'm sure he enjoyed that. To discuss, nationalisation and public ownership of of cannabis, as I've spoke of many times before here on the podcast, of my dream vision of the NHS becoming the ultimate OG cannabis producers here in the UK, and they would provide all of the cannabis for the adult consumption market, as well as providing all of the products and services to the medical industry, to the same grade, to the same criteria, to the same regulations, so that the products are of the highest possible standard. He is pro-EU, obviously, again, that shows my bias. He is a pro-welfare state, which is, again, good. Pro-disabled access and rights. Pro-right to die. Shout out Tom Curran's episode, worth a worth a listen to capture kind of my thoughts on the Right to Die campaign. A really powerful episode, and all respect to Tom, much love, brother. High speed rail, obviously we need infrastructure, but in terms of what they're doing with HS2 and the planned routes to the north, I am air quoting there very aggressively for my audio only listeners there, the so-called north, aka Birmingham. I love you guys down in Birmingham, but I'm not saying these are not the north. You're very firmly the Midlands. Pro-regulation for helping sort of climate change, pro-immigration, unfortunately pro-mass data collection and mass surveillance, but I think that is generally just a trope of modern kind of MPs and their machinations, intentions, I don't know. I enjoyed the conversation. I don't know. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. And we will be back next week with, I believe, drumroll, it is Mila Janssen, Hash Queen, I think. Yeah, I think. If not, be a surprise for you and me. All right, if you enjoyed this one, folks, check us out on patreon.com/The Simpa Life. Check out thesimpalife.com. You'll find less kitchen adverts now. I'm slowly working my way through the website. As you can probably tell by watching the body of my work, I'm not very technically minded. I've had to learn to edit all of these. And as you've just observed with last week's episode, sometimes I get the edit wrong. So learning the website is a whole nother kettle of fish. It's taken me some time, but I'm getting there and I'm enjoying the experience. So as Bill Hicks would say, just enjoy the fucking ride, man. Just enjoy the ride. All right, peace and love, folks. Check me out on all social media platforms. Like, share, subscribe, rate wherever you are on whatever platform. It all helps boost the analytics, because currently I use the word cannabis. I use the word drugs. I use very annoying words to the algorithms and the bots that mean that they kind of shadow ban me and keep us out the way so you don't see. So if you enjoyed this, like I said, share it to someone you love, someone you care about, someone that might enjoy the rambling bullshit that is my podcast. All right, peace and love, folks. It's been a pleasure.